The SAVE Act has become one of the most debated pieces of election legislation in recent years.
Ability to pass his Save America Act. That is the president's sweeping voter ID law that would sharply restrict mail-in voting.
We want to keep America great, and we will do so by approving the Save America Act.
Let me be very clear. The Save America Act does not prohibit anyone from voting with the exception of illegal aliens.
The president has tried to take control of elections, spread misinformation, and threatened folks working to keep elections secure.
Show ID for everything. As Senator Lee said, you show it to get, hopefully not get a ticket. But
if you think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway.
It is something that Senate Republicans have said does not have enough support to pass Congress.
To understand the debate, it helps to separate three different questions. What does the bill actually do? How large is the problem it is trying to solve? And is the proposed solution proportional to that problem? Current federal law already requires every person registering to vote in a federal election to affirm, under penalty of perjury, that they are a United States citizen. Knowingly registering or voting as a non-citizen is already a federal crime. The SAVE Act would add another requirement. Instead of simply signing an oath, applicants would also need to provide documentary proof of citizenship before registering to vote in federal elections. Depending on the circumstances, this could include a U.S. passport, a qualifying birth certificate, together with government-issued identification, naturalization papers, or other documents recognized by the law. The bill also affects how voter registration updates are handled, places additional verification responsibilities on election officials, and limits the ability to register using methods that do not involve presenting documentary proof. Supporters argue these are common sense protections, but the critics argue they represent a significant change to how Americans register to vote.
Hi. Did you also get caught trying to vote in Ohio?
Before discussing voting, it is important to understand the size of the broader population often referenced in this debate. Most major demographic researchers estimate that the unauthorized immigrant population is between approximately 11 and 14 million people. That number sounds large and scary. However, it represents roughly 4% of the United States population. And more importantly, this figure describes people living in the country without legal authorization. It does not describe people voting. This is where the debate changes considerably. Investigations by states, election administrators, academic researchers, and bipartisan organizations have consistently found documented cases of non-citizen voting to be rare relative to the number of ballots cast.
Crime is common. Logic is rare.
For example, Utah reviewed more than 2 million registered voters and identified 1 confirmed non-citizen registration and no confirmed non-citizen votes. And this is Utah. Utah. Moreover, other states' reviews have produced similarly small numbers. Researchers continue to acknowledge that isolated cases do occur, because in the end, no election system is perfect. However, they have generally not found evidence that non-citizen voting occurs on a scale capable of changing federal election outcomes. That distinction is critical because the existence of millions of undocumented immigrants is not evidence that millions are voting. The available evidence does not support that conclusion. Voting illegally carries significant consequences for someone who is not a citizen. Those consequences may include criminal prosecution, removal proceedings, permanent immigration consequences, and losing the possibility of becoming a lawful permanent resident or citizen in the future. In exchange for those risks, the benefit is one vote. Researchers frequently point to this risk-reward calculation as one reason documented cases appear to be uncommon. Critics argue that the bill imposes broad requirements on millions of eligible citizens to address a problem that appears statistically rare. Research suggests that approximately 12% of voting-age citizens, around 28 million people, do not have immediate access to the documents most commonly used to prove citizenship. Many could obtain those documents, but doing so may require fees, travel, replacement records, time away from work, or navigating multiple government agencies. The concern is not that eligible citizens are permanently prevented from voting. The concern is that participation becomes more difficult.
What in the hell was that all about?
Critics also point to practical situations. A person who moves, a student registering in a new state, a married woman whose surname differs from her birth certificate, an older voter who no longer possesses original records. Each may face additional paperwork despite already being legally eligible to vote. The bill also increases legal responsibilities for election officials. Critics argue this creates an incentive for officials to reject uncertain registrations rather than risk legal consequences.
Illegal!
Supporters of the SAVE Act generally make a different argument. They acknowledge that documented cases may be relatively small, but argue that elections should have multiple layers of protection regardless. They contend that citizenship should be verified with documents rather than relying primarily on sworn declarations. Supporters also argue that stronger verification increases public confidence in elections, even if actual fraud is uncommon. Some believe vulnerabilities should be addressed before they become larger problems. Others argue that election integrity deserves a higher level of protection because elections determine the legitimacy of government itself.
Who cares about this stupid election?
Are elections being stolen? This question is at the center of much of the public debate. Some politicians and advocacy groups argue that American elections contain significant fraud involving non-citizens, inaccurate voter rolls, or weaknesses in voting procedures. Others argue that while isolated fraud exists, repeated audits, recounts, criminal investigations, and court proceedings have not found evidence of widespread fraud capable of altering national election outcomes. The disagreement is therefore not whether fraud exists. Nearly everyone agrees that some amount of fraud exists. Again, it's not a perfect system. The disagreement is over its scale. Polling has shown that many Americans, particularly Republicans, believe non-citizen voting occurs more frequently than available evidence indicates. I wonder why. Who's telling them this? This difference between perception and documented evidence is not unique to election policy. Public concern often reflects values, trust in institutions, media coverage, and political leadership as much as statistical frequency. Perhaps the most important issue raised by the SAVE Act is not election law, it is proportionality. Governments regularly confront problems that are real but statistically uncommon. Tax fraud exists, insurance fraud exists, passport fraud, identity theft, medical fraud.
We live in an era of fraud in America, not just in banking, but in government, education, religion, food, even baseball. What bothers me isn't that fraud is not nice or that fraud is mean. It's that for 15,000 years, fraud and short-sighted thinking have never ever worked.
No system eliminates these problems completely. Instead, policymakers ask how much regulation is justified by the size of the problem. If non-citizen voting is rare, how much additional burden should be placed on every eligible voter to reduce that risk further? There is no objective answer. Little. It is ultimately a political and philosophical judgment. Supporters of stricter election laws often argue that even one illegal vote is one too many. As a moral statement, that is compelling. Most people would also agree that one wrongful conviction is too many. One innocent person killed by police is too many. One child dying in a school shooting is too many. One act of corruption by a public official is too many. However, public policy rarely operates on zero-risk principles. If governments attempted to eliminate every possible instance of every undesirable event, society would become extraordinarily restrictive. Nobody wants that. Instead, governments attempt to balance competing harms. In election law, there are two kinds of mistakes. The first is allowing an ineligible person to vote. The second is preventing an eligible citizen from voting. Reducing one type of error often increases the other. A system designed to eliminate nearly every fraudulent registration may also make registration more difficult for legitimate voters. Conversely, a system designed to maximize access may accept a slightly greater risk that an ineligible person slips through. The challenge is deciding where to draw that line.
Not again. The line must be drawn here.
Here's a useful analogy. Traffic accidents kill tens of thousands of Americans every year. Yet, states generally do not require every licensed driver to repeatedly prove eligibility with extensive documentation every time they update an address or renew a license. Instead, enforcement focuses on people who are actually violating the law through targeted investigations, penalties, and oversight. Critics argue election law should follow a similar principle. Target proven wrongdoing rather than increasing requirements for everyone. Supporters argue elections are different because they determine democratic legitimacy and therefore justify stronger preventative measures. Do you really want that restriction on you? The SAVE Act is ultimately not a debate over whether only citizens should vote. Nearly everyone agrees they should. It is a debate over how much additional verification is appropriate, how much burden should be placed on eligible citizens, how society weighs rare risk against broad access, and where the balance between election security and voter participation ought to be drawn. Those questions extend far beyond election law. They reflect one of the oldest challenges in democratic government: balancing security, liberty, trust, and equal participation in a system that can never be completely free of risk. How much restriction do you want? If you'd like to learn more about democracy and the right to vote, I can examine the history of voter qualification laws in the United States, from the post-Reconstruction era amendments through the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and more recent voter ID laws, showing how debates over election integrity and ballot access have evolved over time. Click the like and subscribe button and come back for the next one. There'll be more in the next coming week or so. Oh wait, by the way, become a Patreon member. I almost forgot about that one. These videos are difficult to do on my own time, and having a little extra support goes a long way. So, thank you.